There's a question being debated in every major government on Earth right now, and it is not the one most people think it is. The question is not whether the United States and Iran are at war. They are already at war. The real question, the one that strategic planners from Washington to Beijing are wrestling with this morning, is who will ultimately control the Strait of Hormuz, and what kind of world is born depending on the answer. To understand what has unfolded in the last 48 hours, you first need to understand what the Strait of Hormuz actually represents. It is not simply a narrow body of water sitting between the southern coast of Iran and the tip of the Omani Peninsula. It is the single most important energy corridor on the planet. Before this conflict erupted in late February, roughly 1 in every 5 barrels of oil traded globally passed through that 21-mile-wide choke point. 20% of the world's liquefied natural gas moved through the same passage. Countries across Asia, Europe, and the developing world depended on that waterway the way a hospital depends on its power supply. When the strait closes or becomes too dangerous to transit, the consequences are not felt in the Persian Gulf alone. They ripple outward across every economy, every supply chain, and every energy market on Earth. That is precisely why Iran chose the strait as its primary strategic weapon when the war began on February 28th. And that is precisely why what is happening right now, in mid-July of 2026, is not simply a military confrontation between two nations. It is a struggle over the architecture of the global energy system itself. And the decisions made in the coming hours and days will shape that system for a generation. Let us begin with what has actually happened, because the pace of events has been extraordinary. The United States reimposed its full naval blockade on Iranian ports and coastal areas, with the measure taking effect on Tuesday evening, July 14th. U.S. Central Command reported that approximately 21 American naval vessels are now operating in the region, representing a significant concentration of maritime power in the waters surrounding the strait. On Wednesday morning, U.S. forces conducted a 90-minute wave of precision airstrikes against Iranian coastal defense systems, cruise missile storage facilities, and launch sites along Iran's southern coastline. Among the specific targets struck was Greater Tunb Island, a strategically vital piece of territory in the Persian Gulf that Iran has controlled since 1971, though the United Arab Emirates formally claims it. U.S. Central Command stated that its forces struck Iranian defense and missile launch sites on the island. Later on Wednesday, American forces conducted a second wave of strikes specifically targeting Iranian military capabilities used to threaten vessels transiting the strait. Within hours of the morning strikes, Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps launched retaliatory missile and drone attacks against American military facilities in Bahrain, Jordan, and Kuwait. Jordan's military confirmed that its air defense systems intercepted and destroyed 3 Iranian ballistic missiles entering its airspace during the early morning hours. The IRGC claimed it had struck aircraft shelters housing American F-15, F-16, and F-35 jets, as well as multiple MQ-9 Reaper drones, though those claims require independent verification. Now, let us slow down and think carefully about what this sequence of events actually means strategically, because the significance goes considerably deeper than an exchange of missiles and airstrikes. Greater Tunb Island is not simply another item on an American targeting list. Its location gives whoever controls it a commanding position over the narrowest and most operationally critical section of the Strait of Hormuz. Analysts and military planners have noted for years that the 3 Persian Gulf islands of Abu Musa, Greater Tunb, and Lesser Tunb, all occupied by Iran since 1971, represent what one researcher described as Iran's arch defense, the physical platform from which Tehran can dominate maritime movement through the strait. When the United States strikes missile infrastructure on Greater Tunb, it is not merely degrading Iranian military capacity in a technical sense. It is signaling something far more deliberate and strategically significant. It is telling Tehran, and telling every nation watching, that Washington is prepared to physically contest Iranian control of the key terrain that determines transit through the world's most critical energy waterway. This represents a strategic shift of enormous consequence, and it is one that most coverage of this conflict has not fully examined. For decades, Iran's control of these 3 islands was treated as a political irritant, a source of ongoing tension with the UAE, but ultimately a fait accompli that the international community had neither the means nor the will to reverse. The United States military now striking Iranian installations on those islands changes that calculation entirely. It raises the question, increasingly discussed in analytical circles, of whether Washington has a longer-term intention to alter the status of those islands as part of whatever post-conflict regional settlement emerges. Meanwhile, Iran's Revolutionary Guard issued a statement on Wednesday that deserves the most careful reading. The IRGC declared that oil and gas exports from the entire Middle East region would be, and the phrasing here is deliberately stark, either for everyone or for no one. This is not the language of a military communique about tactical naval operations. This is the language of civilizational economic warfare. What Iran's Revolutionary Guard is threatening is not simply the continued disruption of Iranian energy exports. It is the complete shutdown of energy flows from the entire Persian Gulf region. That means Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Iraq, the United Arab Emirates, and Qatar. Nations that have played no direct military role in this conflict, but whose energy exports power entire continents. Iran is essentially informing the world that if it cannot move its own energy, it possesses the means and the will to ensure that no one else in the region moves theirs either. Let us think carefully about what that threat represents in practice, because it is very easy to read a headline and miss the full strategic weight of the logic behind it. The Persian Gulf region holds a staggering share of the world's proven oil reserves. Saudi Arabia alone holds the second largest proven oil reserves on Earth. The combined energy output of the Gulf states powers manufacturing, transportation, heating, and electricity generation across Asia, Europe, and beyond. If Iran were to act on this threat, whether through direct attacks on Gulf energy infrastructure, through further mining and harassment of maritime shipping lanes, or through striking energy export terminals and pipelines, the consequences for the global economy would be catastrophic in ways that no military campaign could quickly reverse. Oil prices briefly climbed above $86 a barrel in early Asian trading Wednesday morning, already more than 15% higher than the level before the war began in February. But those numbers, troubling as they are, do not capture the full picture of economic vulnerability. The International Monetary Fund issued a stark warning this week that the global oil buffer, which had kept prices from spiking even more severely, is now largely exhausted. Inventories have been drawn down across 5 months of conflict. Spare capacity that was held in reserve has been deployed. The IMF warned bluntly that the world is now starting from a significantly weaker position if another shock arrives. Analysts writing in an IMF publication put it this way: as tensions flare again in the Strait of Hormuz, that room is now smaller and shrinking further as spare capacity has been deployed, demand has compressed, and inventories have been drawn down. The message behind that technical language is direct. The cushion that policymakers assumed existed when this conflict began has been spent. We are now in the phase of this crisis where any further escalation hits harder and faster than the early models predicted, precisely because the economic shock absorbers have already been consumed. And yet, the military dynamics continue to evolve at an extraordinary pace. U.S. Central Command has confirmed that American forces conducted what amounted to continuous strike operations across multiple days this week, involving fighter aircraft, unmanned combat drones, and naval vessels. In a 5-hour mission earlier this week, U.S. forces struck military targets across a wide range of Iranian locations, including Bushehr, Chabahar, Jask, Konarak, Abu Musa, and Bandar Abbas, targeting coastal defense systems, missile and drone sites, and maritime capabilities. The target list has expanded steadily beyond purely naval assets. Strikes reportedly hit an Iranian army barracks for the 388th Mechanized Infantry Brigade in Sistan and Baluchistan province. Other strikes targeted the submarine and ship maintenance facility at Bandar Abbas Naval Base, one of Iran's most significant naval installations on the strait. Earlier in this week's escalation cycle, strikes hit the city of Abadan, which hosts the oldest operating oil refinery in the Middle East, as well as the port city of Mashhad, Keshm Island, and Kish Island. The geographic breadth of the American campaign signals something important. Washington is not conducting a narrow, precisely bounded operation to clear specific naval threats. It is conducting a systematic campaign to degrade Iran's capacity to project military power across its entire southern coastline. Iran is simultaneously pressing its own counter-campaign with a determination that has surprised some analysts who expected Tehran's military responses to diminish under sustained American pressure. The IRGC struck 2 UAE-flagged tankers in Omani territorial waters in the Strait of Hormuz earlier this week. The tankers Al-Bahia and Mombasa were both hit by Iranian missiles, while transiting what Iran described as unauthorized routes. An Indian crew member aboard one of the vessels was killed. The attack represented one of the most direct strikes yet against commercial shipping under the flag of a Gulf state. Iran's actions against commercial shipping are not random acts of military frustration. They follow a coherent, strategic logic that is important to understand clearly. Tehran is attempting to demonstrate to the entire international shipping community, to the companies that own tankers and the insurers who back them, that operating in the Strait of Hormuz without Iranian permission is not simply legally contested, but physically dangerous. Every tanker struck, every crew member endangered, every insurance premium that rises in response sends a message to shipping companies around the world. That message is that the cost of ignoring Iranian authority over the strait is real, measurable, and potentially fatal. This pressure campaign has been significantly effective. Before the war began in February, 147 commercial ships crossed the Strait of Hormuz on a typical day. By early July, that number had fallen to just 22 crossings where there were 147. That is not a disruption of international trade. That is a near complete collapse of transit through the world's most critical energy corridor, and the implications of sustaining that collapse extend far beyond the Persian Gulf into the economic arteries of the entire global system. The United States Treasury moved in parallel with the military campaign this week, imposing new financial pressure on Iran through sanctions specifically targeting what authorities described as a sophisticated sanctions evasion network. The Treasury Department announced it had frozen more than $130 million by sanctioning cryptocurrency wallets linked to Iran's central bank. Washington also announced fresh sanctions targeting 50 individuals, entities, and vessels allegedly involved in facilitating Iranian oil exports in violation of existing restrictions, focusing particularly on the network of shipping magnate Mohammad Hossein Shamkhani. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent described the Shamkhani network as one of the Iranian regime's most profitable engines for generating revenue despite international sanctions. This three-dimensional combination of military strikes, naval blockade, and financial pressure represents the full application of American coercive power. The theory underlying the campaign is that sustained pressure across all three dimensions will eventually force Iran's leadership back to the negotiating table on terms acceptable to Washington. But there's a counter-logic at work in Tehran that equally deserves serious analytical attention. President Trump issued a stark public warning to Iran on Tuesday, stating that unless Tehran returned to negotiations, the United States would begin targeting Iranian power plants and bridges. He added that he was reserving energy infrastructure targets for last, suggesting that such targets remain on the targeting list, but are being deliberately withheld as ultimate leverage. This posture reveals the fundamental tension at the heart of American strategic thinking in this campaign. Washington wants Iran to stop threatening the Strait and to accept a settlement on American terms. But the United States does not necessarily want to preside over the collapse of the Iranian state, because a failed state in the Persian Gulf would generate consequences that would be extraordinarily difficult and costly to manage. Destroying Iran's power infrastructure would accelerate an internal collapse that carries its own unpredictable and potentially catastrophic risks. Iran, for its part, has publicly hardened its position in ways that suggest Tehran has made a deliberate decision to project maximum resolve even as American military pressure intensifies. Iran's foreign ministry spokesman stated this week that Tehran has no plans for negotiations at the moment and is focused entirely on defense. The IRGC issued a declaration that the strait would remain closed until what it described as the end of America's evils. This language is maximalist, and it represents a significant shift from the posture that produced the June Memorandum of Understanding. Whether that hardened position reflects genuine strategic resolve, or whether it is a negotiating stance designed to create maximum leverage before returning to diplomacy, is one of the central analytical questions of this moment. History suggests it is likely some combination of both. The June Memorandum of Understanding deserves careful examination, because understanding what it was and why it failed is essential to understanding where this conflict stands now and where it may go. After roughly 60 days of negotiations, following an April ceasefire, the United States and Iran signed an agreement intended to create a pathway toward ending the war. The deal paused major hostilities, established a framework for diplomatic talks on deeper issues, including Iran's nuclear program, and the strait was supposed to reopen to commercial shipping. But the agreement began showing serious stress almost from the moment it was signed. Both sides accused the other of violations before the ink had fully dried. Iran continued to interfere with shipping attempting to transit the waterway. The United States continued airstrikes against Iranian military infrastructure. By early July, the ceasefire was effectively dead in practice, even as it nominally remained on the books. The collapse accelerated rapidly. On July 7th, Iran fired on 3 commercial vessels in Omani territorial waters near the strait. U.S. Central Command launched immediate strikes in response as punishment. Iran warned it would deliver a crushing response. The IRGC announced strikes against 85 American military targets across Bahrain and Kuwait. President Trump, speaking at the NATO summit in Turkey on July 8th, declared the Memorandum of Understanding over, calling Iran's leadership evil and sick people. Within hours, the U.S. launched additional strikes. On July 9th, Tehran reported that American forces had struck a railway bridge in northern Iran, while CENTCOM confirmed hitting approximately 90 military targets in another round of operations. The spiral had become self-reinforcing, each action generating a response that justified the next escalation in the classic pattern that historians of conflict recognize as the mechanism through which limited wars become unlimited ones. What this arc reveals with painful clarity is that the fundamental strategic disagreement between the two sides was never actually resolved by the June agreement. It was paused. The Americans demanded unimpeded international navigation through the Strait of Hormuz as the baseline condition of any sustainable settlement. The Iranians sought recognition of their authority to regulate, control, and ultimately profit from traffic through what they regard as their sovereign domain. These two positions are not merely far apart. They reflect genuinely incompatible visions of regional order. One side believes the strait belongs to the international system, and that freedom of navigation is a universal right that no single nation can unilaterally revoke. The other side believes the strait is an Iranian strategic asset, and that Tehran's authority to manage passage through it is a legitimate expression of sovereignty. That incompatibility explains why each ceasefire has collapsed, why each diplomatic initiative has stalled, and why the military exchange continues to escalate despite the costs to both sides. The exchange of strikes is the visible surface. The invisible but more fundamental contest is over who sets the rules that govern one of the world's most critical waterways. The legal dimension of this conflict adds another layer of complexity that shapes how different nations are positioning themselves. The United States is not a signatory to the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, the primary international legal framework governing transit passage through international straits. When President Trump announced this week that the United States would serve as the guardian of the Strait of Hormuz, and he initially proposed collecting a 20% reimbursement fee on all cargo passing through under American protection, legal experts immediately noted that this proposal had no clear foundation in international maritime law. Trump subsequently walked back the tolling proposal, announcing that Gulf nations would instead be expected to make trade and investment commitments to the United States economy in exchange for American protection of the waterway. But the broader signal embedded in that announcement was unmistakable. Washington is positioning itself not simply as a military actor restoring international norms, but as a power seeking to establish a new order in the Persian Gulf on American terms, with the United States as the permanent guarantor and primary beneficiary of access to the world's most critical energy corridor. This is not the same thing as restoring the status quo that existed before February, and Beijing, Moscow, and much of the rest of the world are watching this distinction with great care and growing concern. China's strategic position in this conflict is one of the most consequential and least discussed dimensions of the entire crisis. China is the world's largest oil importer. A substantial portion of that oil originates in the Persian Gulf, and the majority of it historically transited through the Strait of Hormuz. China has powerful economic incentives to want the strait reopened and stable commercial shipping restored. Chinese refineries have reportedly been increasing their crude imports in recent weeks, according to shipping data tracking commodity flows, suggesting Beijing is repositioning its procurement strategy to cope with the disruption while managing its longer-term exposure. But China also has deep strategic interests in not allowing the United States to establish itself as the permanent hegemon of the Persian Gulf's maritime system. A world in which Washington controls the Strait of Hormuz, can charge fees on global energy shipping, and positions itself as the guardian of the waterway, is a world in which American leverage over China's energy supply chain has expanded in a fundamental and potentially irreversible way. That is not an outcome Beijing will accept passively. The question being asked in analytical communities is whether China is using its considerable influence with Tehran, built over years of economic partnership and energy deals, to communicate to Iranian leadership that a prolonged closure of the strait ultimately damages Chinese economic interests more than it serves Iranian strategic goals. If that back-channel pressure is being applied, it may eventually prove to be the most decisive diplomatic factor in determining when and how this conflict finds a resolution. Russia's strategic calculus is more straightforward and considerably more cynical. Moscow is a major energy exporter that has benefited substantially from the disruption of Persian Gulf energy flows. Every week that the Hormuz crisis continues is a week in which Russian oil and gas gains market share with buyers who can no longer reliably source Persian Gulf crude, and a week in which Russia's economic leverage over energy-dependent economies increases. Moscow has limited incentive to push aggressively for a settlement that would restore normal Persian Gulf energy exports, because a return to normalcy reduces the premium that Russian energy commands in global markets. This structural incentive shapes Russian diplomatic behavior in ways that outside observers should factor carefully into their analysis of the international diplomatic landscape surrounding this conflict. The regional dimension of this crisis is evolving in ways that add further complexity to an already intricate strategic picture. The IRGC's retaliatory strikes against American military facilities in Bahrain, Jordan, Kuwait, and Qatar are not simply military operations directed at American forces. They are political messages directed at the governments of those states, asking whether their partnership with Washington is worth the cost of Iranian missiles landing on their territory. Bahrain activated emergency sirens and directed residents to seek shelter during recent Iranian strikes. Qatar's Ministry of Defense confirmed intercepting missile attacks targeting the country. Jordan's military engaged 3 Iranian ballistic missiles. These are not abstract military exchanges happening in someone else's airspace. They are direct kinetic consequences being delivered to Gulf capitals that host American forces, and they are forcing Gulf leaders to make calculations about the sustainability of their current alignment with Washington. The United Nations Secretary General issued a warning this week describing the potential for catastrophic consequences from further escalation in the conflict, while the UN's shipping agency declared the Strait of Hormuz too dangerous for commercial vessels to navigate safely. 2 commercial ships attempting to transit the strait under the new American blockade were turned around by U.S. naval forces in the first 17 hours of the Reimposed blockade. During the previous 2-month blockade that ran from April through June, U.S. Central Command reported that 142 ships were redirected and 9 were disabled for failing to comply. The reimposition of those procedures signals that the United States is prepared to sustain another extended blockade period, accepting the global economic costs that come with it on the calculation that the pressure on Iran will prove more decisive than the pressure on American political will. That calculation may be correct, but it carries risks that the sheer military firepower of the American campaign cannot neutralize. The domestic political debate inside the United States over this conflict is intensifying in ways that Tehran is monitoring with considerable interest. Senate Democrats moved to block a $1 trillion defense bill in direct protest over the Iran war on Monday. House Republicans simultaneously unveiled a $95 billion spending plan for conflict-related costs. The political argument over the war's costs, duration, and strategic purpose is becoming louder, more public, and more consequential. Tehran understands that American military power is overwhelming. What Iran's strategists are calculating is whether American political will is durable enough to sustain the campaign long enough to achieve its objectives. This is the asymmetry at the heart of conflicts between great powers and regional powers, and it is one that history suggests should not be underestimated. The United States has the capacity to bomb Iranian military infrastructure indefinitely. What no military campaign can guarantee is the political sustainability at home that determines whether the campaign can run long enough to achieve its strategic purpose. There's another dimension to this conflict that rarely receives the attention it deserves, and that is the situation inside Iran itself. Under the cover of the conflict, political repression has intensified. Organizations monitoring human rights inside Iran report that the regime has executed at least 47 political prisoners so far this year, a dramatic increase compared to the same period in the prior year. Widespread protests erupted across the country in the closing months of the previous year, and President Trump issued public warnings to Iranian leadership against a violent crackdown on demonstrators. The internal political situation in Iran is not disconnected from the strategic dynamics playing out in the Strait of Hormuz. A regime under maximum external military and economic pressure simultaneously faces internal political pressure from a population that has endured enormous hardship across years of sanctions and now active war. How Iranian leadership manages that dual pressure, balancing the need to project external resolve while managing internal stability, is a critical variable that shapes every decision Tehran makes about escalation, negotiation, and the terms on which it would accept a settlement. What are the realistic scenarios from this point forward? And what should informed observers be watching for as this crisis continues to evolve? The first scenario is a negotiated return to something resembling the June memorandum framework, with both sides finding an off-ramp that allows each government to claim enough of what it needs to justify stopping the current escalation cycle. For this to happen, several conditions would need to align. Iran would need to see sufficient military pressure to justify a return to talks without appearing to capitulate. Washington would need a diplomatic formula that allows Trump to claim the strait is secure without locking the United States into an indefinitely expensive commitment to serve as the Gulf's permanent military policeman. And some third-party diplomatic channel, whether Oman, which has historically served as a back channel between Washington and Tehran, or another actor, would need to provide the framework within which both sides can conduct discussions without public commitment. The second scenario is a prolonged military campaign that gradually erodes Iranian military capability near the strait to the point where commercial shipping volume slowly recovers without any formal diplomatic agreement being reached. This is a scenario in which the war neither fully ends nor fully escalates, but rather settles into a grinding, sustained military operation with enormous ongoing costs for the global economy, for American military resources, and for Iranian society. The third scenario, assessed as lowest probability but not impossible by serious analysts, is the one that haunts strategic planners most severely. It is the scenario in which Iran follows through on the IRGC's threat to shut down all Middle East energy exports, triggering an energy shock of a magnitude that no existing economic buffer can absorb, and potentially drawing other regional and global powers into direct involvement in ways that fundamentally change the nature and scale of the conflict. What this moment ultimately reveals, when you step back from the daily exchange of strikes and statements and look at the full strategic picture, is the profound historical weight of the choice the world is navigating. The Strait of Hormuz is not simply a piece of contested geography in the Middle East. It is the nervous system of the global energy economy, and the contest over who controls it is a contest over the structure of the world order itself. The United States believes it can reshape the Middle East's strategic architecture through the application of overwhelming military force and economic pressure. Iran believes it can impose costs high enough, across enough dimensions, to outlast American political resolve. Both calculations may ultimately prove to be wrong, and in the space between those competing miscalculations, the consequences for ordinary people, for energy markets, for supply chains, for the economies of nations thousands of miles from the Persian Gulf, compound with every passing day. The number that stays with you, that captures the full weight of this crisis more than any strategic analysis can, is this. Before the war began, 147 ships crossed the Strait of Hormuz every single day. As of early July, that number had fallen to 22. 147 to 22. That is not a disruption. That is a near complete fracture of the artery through which a fifth of the world's energy supply flows. What comes next will not be determined by missiles or carriers or targeting lists alone, as decisive as military power remains in shaping the options available to each side. It will be determined by which leadership makes the critical miscalculation first, by whether a diplomatic channel that neither side is currently advertising publicly can find a formula that allows both governments to stop the cycle without losing the domestic political standing that each leadership needs to survive. History tells us that most conflicts of this type do not end at the moment of maximum military intensity. They end in the exhausted aftermath, when both sides have spent enough of what they cannot afford to lose to recognize that continuing costs more than stopping. The question that no analyst can answer with certainty as of this morning is how close we are to that moment, and what the world's energy system, its trade routes, and its geopolitical balance will look like when it finally arrives. That is the question worth watching. That is the question on which everything else depends.